Hey, good morning, everyone. Grace and peace. Welcome to Find the Intersection. Today we're talking about Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 to 7. Great passage. So let's jump in. So the prophet Isaiah is sharing a song. And in my Bible, it's labeled the Song of the Unfruitful Vineyard. Just a few things that stood out to me as I read through these 7 verses today. The first is this is a love song. So God is singing a love song on behalf of his people, and he uses the metaphor of a vineyard to communicate that. So first thing is the metaphor of the vineyard. So a vineyard is something that God loves, God cares for. He clears it out. He takes time to make it the way it needs to be, with the hope that it will yield grapes to be able to make wine, right? So that's the hope of this. So it's a love song because God loves his vineyard, but it's also a song of disappointment. So the second thing I see in this is God did all of this out of love for the vineyard, but he, in verse number 3, says, "Now inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What was there to do more for my vineyard that I've not already done? And when I expected it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes?" So wild grapes are not productive. It would not be the hope of this God's vineyard to produce wild grapes. You want to produce good grapes so it could make good wine, right? So God is asking, what more could I have done? And so really in verse number 5 through 6, it communicates, well, God's going to let them have what they want. So if this vineyard wants to grow wild grapes, it will be devoured by animals from the outside. There won't be the protection that is needed. So this metaphor runs through verses 1 to 6. We see it's a love song about a vineyard, and we also see it's a song of disappointment because the vineyard didn't produce the hopes, the expectations of the owner. And then verse number 7 is the explanation of what this little story is all about. So verse 7, it says, "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah is his pleasant planting." So really it's the metaphor is about God's people, right? And he expected justice, but he saw bloodshed. He expected righteousness, but heard a cry. So the metaphor of the grapes, the wild grapes would be the bloodshed and the crying, and he hoped for good grapes, which would have been justice and righteousness. So this is a really interesting and powerful metaphor that God is trying to use to communicate that his people, who he intended to be righteous and just people, to take care of the poor, to take care of those around them, the lower side of society, didn't. And so the society became about violence, and the society became about self-righteousness, and people were crying and they were screaming out. And so God removed his protection and allowed the people to get what they wanted, which they ended up in exile, right? Destroyed by Babylon and ended up in exile. So that's the story of God's people. It's our story too, because God intends for us to bear fruit. And when we produce wild grapes, when we produce injustice, when we produce violence, when we produce hurting people and they're crying out, God lets us have what we want. I think a lot of times the state of the world that we live in is a result of things like this. God lets us have what we want. He doesn't stop working to bring about his love and his plan, but ultimately he lets us have what we want, and that ultimately leads to exile. And exile is where we're not where we're supposed to be. We're not home. So anyway, that's what I got out of this. Can you share what you got out of the passage in the comments? Hey, tonight, if you're a Southsider, we are doing the Intersection Bible Study in the sanctuary at 7 o'clock. We did that last week. Good turnout. So I invite you to join. Hey, let's continue our journey tomorrow. We're going to be in Psalm 80. And then Friday, we'll talk about the themes of the week. Grace and peace, everyone. Have an awesome day.